I am recording this lecture, but because of where it's at and don't need to have everybody's face on the video, y'all are welcome. I'm not going to be facing it towards the projector. However, the slides that I will be using today, I will post a PDF of them on Canvas, so you'll have access to those. Sound good? All right, so today we are going to go over the first chapter in Beautiful Web Design by Jason Baird. If you haven't read this chapter, you should have read the chapter. However, this is kind of a weird lecture in the fall semester because we have the Labor Day holiday on Monday, Wednesday classes. Typically, I usually combine this lecture with the Chapter 2 lecture, which is on color. But, because you guys are currently working on a table, and because we lost that one day in Labor Day, I've decided to split this up rather than actually do it back-to-back next week on Monday. Plus, I think I've given you guys enough information this week to begin with. You might disagree. No? Okay. All right. So, we're going to go over Chapter 1 in this book. We'll talk a little bit about layout. I think Jason does a good job of talking about it from the standpoint of composition. Does anybody have, you've got the blue covered 4th edition. Is the first chapter still composition, or does he call it something else now?
Layout and composition.
Layout and composition. Okay, that's fine. And again, it really doesn't matter which edition you've got. The information is pretty much the same. The difference is really going to be there's a couple of, erratas, or in publishing, those are just errors in the actual text that have been corrected, as well as updated photos. Because if you actually take a look at some of the photos here, like, this one right here in the first edition, it's like, okay, this is a really nice version of what we call skeuomorphism that we really don't use in web design anymore. That was cool back in 2000. So the new edition actually has some updated photos, which is really nice to have. And we'll talk about layout here in just a minute. But this particular chapter is going to start us off not only in the next couple of weeks going through each one of these individual chapters. In fact, make sure over the weekend, this is going to be your only homework over the weekend, whichever one should say. I haven't said it yet, but I mean it should be like yeah, is to read chapter 2. Okay? Applause. So, thank you. So read chapter 2 in the book is going to be your only homework for tonight. Of course, the table assignment needs to be due before you leave. So I mentioned all of that just to basically say this. Once I'm done with the lecture, after you've turned in your table assignment, you're done for the night. Sound good? Okay. Unless you bug me, then I can give you extra work.
No.
Okay. So let's go ahead and get started on this. Now, this chapter, layout and composition, in the past, how I've actually taught this particular topic is we kind of touched on some of the basics of layout, some of the basics of design composition, but a lot of that stuff has actually kind of made its way into our basic graphic design course. So I'm not going to harp nearly as much on some of the design concepts that are in the first chapter. In fact, what I'm going to use it as is a springboard into a much broader topic of UI UX design, which is where we're going to focus kind of the last third of this semester. So this will kind of be our first introduction into what is UI UX design, what are some of the guiding principles, and we'll talk about some of the concepts around UI UX design today, specifically different kinds of layout types. So before we get started, does anybody have any questions? Okay. So we get started. So in the book, Jason does a good job of explaining what he calls good design, and I'll just kind of read from this. And he says, there are two main standpoints from which most people determine whether a website design is good or bad. And I think, from a subjective point of view, I think we all kind of have our own ideas as far as what makes something good or bad. There's a strict usability standpoint. Usability is the key word there, so if you're in the book and you see that word usability in chapter 1, you can underline it, which focuses on functionality, the effective presentation of the information, and the efficacy, or the efficiency, excuse me. Then there's the purely aesthetic approach. So, functionality versus presentation, right? How well does it work? versus how nice does it look. Then there's the purely aesthetic perspective, which is all about presentation, animation, sexy graphics. Some designers get caught up in the aesthetics and the graphics and forget about the user, and some usability, quote, gurus get lost in their user testing and forget about the visual appeal. So he boils it down to this one sentence. This is a good sentence to remember. In order to reach people and retain their interests, it's essential to maximize both. Do we agree or disagree with that statement? Yeah? Why?
You want to be functional and you want to attract the viewer.
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is that a website, first and foremost, should communicate something to the user. Not all websites are purely commercial. Okay? In other words, they can't all be Amazon. But even if they were all Amazon, the design, the layout of Amazon should also communicate information to the user, right? How many of y'all in here have actually used Amazon reviews? I'm about to say comments, not comments. Some are comments. How many of you have used Amazon reviews before you've purchased something? One person in here? Liars. Okay, right? Everybody in here, for the most part, probably has looked at an Amazon review before they have made a purchase. And has that swayed you one way or the other? Have you ever gone to an Amazon review, seen that it has like 1.5 star, and realized, I'm putting that back on the shelf, right? We've all seen that before. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm using Amazon specifically to purchase that item, but I am using Amazon in order to find information, right? And a lot of websites kind of lose track of this aspect, that your job as a website designer is to communicate to the user. Yes, they kind of get caught up on this idea that a lot of websites should also do what's called conversion, which is make that user spend money. It's what we call conversion. User comes and uses it, user buys whatever it is that site is selling. But the vast majority of people that are using a client's website are not going to actually pull the trigger and buy something. The vast majority of them, in fact, are there to look up information, to either aid them and help them come to an informed buying decision, and then eventually you get the conversion, or they're there just window shopping. Either way, the point is that we need to be able to, as designers, present the information in a usable way and also a visually appealing way. This is where we get into UI, UX design. And it's just simply the letters UI/UX. The UI stands for user interface, and the UX stands for user experience. So from the aesthetic point of view, you're making an interface. Some sort of a graphical representation in which a user will interact in some way to be able to get their information. At the same time, because they do have an experience and there is a functionality to this website, that's where user experience comes into play. What sort of experience does the user actually want to have? So we have the functionality and we've got the aesthetics. For the vast majority of everybody in here, except for a few of you who've said you're really interested in doing things more on the web development side, the web programming side, the vast majority of everybody in here really only cares about the aesthetics, right? It's the UI part of that UI UX pie that really makes a difference for you. That's what you're interested in. You want to learn about design. But as Jason really points out here, in order to reach people and retain their interest, it's essential to maximize both of these things. So even if you really don't care about mundane things like user testing, A/B testing, understanding UX design concepts, we're still going to go over them in this class, and they will help aid you as a designer. And here's the great thing. Even though this is a web design course, a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about in UI UX design can be applied to other areas of this industry. And I don't mean web industry, I'm talking about the design industry. Because whether or not somebody is interacting with a website, or somebody is interacting with a poster, or somebody is interacting with a book you've laid out, or somebody is interacting with a menu that you have created, or somebody is interacting with a business card that you've designed. Doesn't matter what it is, they are interacting with it some way, shape, or form. Any questions about that before we move on? So, user interface is the aesthetic layout of the website. User experience, UX, design is the functionality of the website. And they both have to be working in harmony with one another in order for everything to work out. So, Jason starts off talking about some principles here in design. 3, in fact, that helps us kind of guide us through this concept of making sure that we are both paying attention to the aesthetic and the functionality. So the first one is that users are pleased by the design, but what are they actually are there for? I mentioned it earlier. What are they really there for?
The content.
Yeah, they're there for the content, right? The information, right? I think we can all agree that, have you ever been to a website that looks horrible, but had information that you thought maybe you needed? Was that a good experience for you? No? How many of you, and be honest, truly judge a book by its cover, and the minute you come to a website that looks terrible, you're clicking off, you're going back to that Google search to go down to the next one on the list? Okay? Many of you are like, oh yeah, right? I can't click back fast enough to get off of a bad design website. And it doesn't matter if that website had all the information you needed, was 100% accurate, and was going to able to help you in whatever it is that you're searching for. A bad design can turn somebody off very, very quickly. And I think for a lot of us who are in the older generations, we don't exactly understand just how short of a first impression we now get with the younger generations when it comes to online content. Some of you younger individuals in here never had to deal with the patience of waiting minutes for a web page to load. Your patience is measured in seconds, and sometimes microseconds. It's like, I want it now. Remember that, who was it, in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Veruca Salt, right? I'm not talking about the Johnny Depp one. I'm talking about the original one, Gene Wilder, the better one, where they cut heads off of chickens, suck kids up into chocolate tubes, and it's just great. Blow kids up into giant blueberries. So, in that one, there's this one character, and she's, I want it now, right? That was her entire song. I don't care, I want it now. And that sounds terrible, but that's kind of the direction everybody is going now when it comes to the high-speed internet, being able to get onto websites. It's one of the things that when I was talking about adding images to your website, we took a look at how big, in file size, how big some of these images were. And if your website takes long to load, it may be a very beautiful website, but then you're on the back side of this other problem, and that is the attention span of the user isn't going to sit around and wait nowadays 10, 20, 30 seconds for something to load. So it has to be usable. It has to draw them in. But more importantly, once you actually get them into the website and got them hooked, sounds a bad way to say it, but once you have them hooked, the content has to be readily available, and it has to be what the user is looking for. So on the flip side of that, how many times have you gone to a website that looks great but you can't find anything? Had that happen before? It's like, man, site looks nice, I just can't use it, or I can't find what I'm looking for. Google says it exists here, but does it really? So both of these things kind of have to be in this kind of balance where you've got aesthetics and you've got usability. And that's not to say that it's a 50-50 proposition. In other words, your design is only going to be able to take you so far, and then the rest of it has to be the content and the experience, right? You can have great experience and great design all in one, but here's where things start to fall apart. To get something that is high quality, highly usable, with fantastic content takes time, a lot of time, a lot of effort, more importantly, usually a lot of money. And a lot of clients usually only have one and not the other. They'll say, we'll throw money at the problem, but I need it yesterday. Or they'll say, I can take 6 months to get this thing done, but I only have a very small budget to do it in. And this is a problem of all designers. So, in the most, I guess, ideal world, you would have as much time as necessary and as much funding as necessary in order to pull off a design that would hit every single mark every single time. But that's not always going to be the case. So you have to learn to pick and choose your battles. Now that's where user experience comes into play, because what we'll end up talking about, especially a little bit later on, understanding what the audience is looking for will help guide a lot of your design decisions. Because as designers, we want to do all the cool stuff, right? We want to make it look as nice as possible. But spending all that time doing that does not necessarily mean that that's what the user is looking for. We might be able to do 75% of that work and have a website that the vast majority of users thinks is the most beautiful thing they've ever seen. But if we spent the other 25% chasing that rabbit hole, then what we end up with is a site that may look nice but functionally is inadequate. So you got to watch for this particular balance. The next concept he talks about here, the next principle, is that users can move about easily based on its navigation. So, an intuitive navigation. How many people here have ever used a navigation on a website before? We've all used navigation. Can we all agree some navigations are better than others? Case in point, how many people have used the TCC website navigation? Did you find it a pleasant experience? Why not? Why didn't you find it a pleasant experience?
Because you didn't create it.
Don't give me that much credit. All right, let's see. Let's bring this over, shall we? Because I didn't create it. Like, good answer. All right. So, here's the TCC website. It has navigation. Right? Now, what's wrong? First and foremost, let's identify what we're talking about. Where is the navigation on the site?
Yes.
The bar at the top.
Where?
The bar at the top.
The bar at the top.
Home and mission.
Okay, so the bar that starts home, admission, academic services, community, about locations, and COVID-19. Are there any other navigation elements on here?
Search.
Search, that is a type of navigation. Anything else?
On top, give.
Yeah.
TCC, jobs.
Give, Inside TCC, Jobs, Current Students, and Canvas. How many people didn't even recognize that that was even up there? There's a good reason for that. It gets into usability, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. So, I think we all agree the main navigation of the site starts off with home, right? It's right underneath the logo. What's wrong with the navigation? Wait, well, let me be a little bit more specific. When you use the navigation on the TCC website, what was it about that experience that left you wanting? What was the problem? Your specific problem. What did you try? What did you find troublesome?
Usually, the first time first thing I will seek is the login, sign in.
Log in? Okay.
Sign in.
So that's a good question. So is there a place to log in here?
So when I'm on my phone compared to computer, the computer is much easier to navigate than on my phone.
Yeah, we'll talk about mobile design strategies here in just a minute. But let's go back to that first point. Is there a place to log in? Each and every one of you have a login, right? If you wanted to log into TCC's website, where do you go?
Current student.
Current students. you'd have to go to current students, which will then take you to another page, which then will take you to wherever you need to go, where there you can actually log in.
That's,
From a usability standpoint, from an experience standpoint, is that a good experience for you?
no, it's zero.
No, it's terrible.
Pass to another and another.
Yeah, I mean I want, again, for Rukasol, I want to now. I want to sign in. Give me something that says sign in. Well, that's a good idea. We don't have that on our website. Let me ask you another question. How many of you, before you became students at TCC, came to this website? How many of you found it, from the navigation standpoint, easy to understand where it is you needed to go? Why not? For the record, everybody watching the video, everyone's shaking their head no. So why not? Why wasn't it easy to understand where to go?
I think because before we used to do like, I guess there's like WebAdvisor,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's hard to really figure that out. Even if you go to the search engine and search it, there's so many other tabs to go, like, and that's where you kind of like figure out where your classes are and like how everything goes. But on this website, it's hard to like navigate where to get from there.
Yeah. So it's hard to navigate as a first-time student because you don't know what you don't know. And here's the problem. How many of you had a little bit of an issue or had to look up what some of these terms actually mean? Because I've had students in the past say, I didn't know what admission was, right? I'm looking for like a sign-up button, right? Or enroll button. I didn't know what admission was. I'm not looking to make a confession. Okay? I didn't know what that was. I'm looking specifically to, try to find a specific degree plan or trying to find out information on how to, basically attend classes in the next semester. There's nothing up here at the top that's telling me to be able to do this. Now, if I were to scroll down, I now have I want to, but here's the problem I've got. Apply for admissions, register for classes. Which one do you click on first? Which one would you have thought, if you were a brand new student, to click on first? Which one? Apply. How many people thought register for classes? Okay, see where the disconnect is? Right? Nowadays, you got to apply to college before you can register for classes, right? But, I mean, there's no hierarchy here. Can we agree?
Yeah.
They're all the same size. They're all spaced out the same. They all have pretty much the same contrast when it comes to the font size and everything else. There's nothing here that tells me, step one, do this. Am I a new student? Yes. Do this first. There's nothing there. I want to, okay, great. Mo, maybe if I go down to getting started at TCC. Oh my gosh. New to college student. Well, I'm not new to a college student. I'm just a new college student. See the difference in the English language here? Okay? I don't want to get to know a college student. I want to be a college student. I'm a high school student. No. Online student. No. Non-credit student. What is that? Transfer student. I did go to high school and I will be transferring to TCC. Is that me? See where the problem is with the lingo and the information? And not only that, again, you have such a massive communication screw up here because you're not being clear. You're making every one of those options exactly the same to the user based on the way that you've actually designed it. From a functionality standpoint, this website fails 10 times out of 10 times. Cut that. So, that's the problem. Now, additionally, intuitive navigation works best as long as you A, keep it simple, B, keep it easy to find, keep it simple, easy to find, and C, communicate clearly. Keep it simple, easy to find, and communicate clearly. And in this case, I can tell you, without doubt, that the reason why this particular menu looks the way that it has is because it suffers from a very terrible affliction. It's called design by committee. Now, Corey's right. I did not design this page. And it would cost them a lot of money to ask me to do it. But, so I didn't want the job. Here's the thing. Back when I first got started here, we were in the process of redesigning our website. Now, this was 2 versions ago. So, I had asked the head of the IT department to allow my Web Design 2 students to be part of the user testing for the new design. I thought it would be a great experience for the students and then also a good learning experience for the class as a whole as far as how that actually is done. They agreed, and we were to begin actually testing the design of the new website. One of the areas that I was really interested in testing was the navigation, and hopefully get the students' inputs on how we can make the navigation work best for current students and new to college students. However, in a weird twist of fate, so to speak, the week after they said yes, somebody got a really good idea downtown to instead send the beta of the website to every single faculty member in the district for feedback. Let me just
Collage.
yeah. So let me just set the stage this way. Let's say you are a rewards member at the Cheesecake Factory. And the Cheesecake Factory sends you emails. And one day they send an email out to everybody and say, hey, we're redesigning our menu. Here's our new proposed menu. Please give us feedback. As a designer, before you run out of the room screaming, how would that make you feel? Now, here's the problem with that, and here's the reason why this looks the way it does. This is a really good example of ignoring your target audience. You see, back when they were redesigning the website, they identified 3 different audience types. 3 types of users who would pretty much come to the TCC website. Okay, at first, you guys are in 2 of those categories, or at least you were in one and you're now currently in the second. And that would be somebody who's never been to college before, has never been to TCC before. The second one is a current student of TCC. The third one is a community member, somebody who actually is in the Tarrant County area, a community around the actual colleges. Those are the 3 audience types. They did not consider a 4th audience type, which was faculty, for good reason. We don't need to use the webpage. I have no need for the information that's on the TCC homepage. Period. As a faculty member. I have no need for it. How many of you as current students have a need for any of the information that's on the TCC homepage? How many of you just come here just to click on the Canvas link? Right? That's the total sum of what you use this page for now. Well, back when they were redesigning it, they were thinking about ways in order to streamline the process to help students register for classes and at the same time for current students to be able to find information about what's going on in campus, which would also bleed over into the community in case there were community-based events. Now, I don't know about y'all, but that sounds like a far more usable homepage than what we currently have here at TCC. But when that email went out to the faculty members with that beta version of the site, every single faculty member came up with some missing jargon, lingo, academic speak, reason as to why 20 different things need to be added back into the main navigation. And what ended up happening was a bloated navigation that was not clearly defined and difficult for the target audience to actually use. But aesthetically, looks okay. Right? Functionally, it's terrible. Absolutely terrible. It doesn't look functionally terrible But it is, and this is an issue later on when we talk about learning what the audience actually needs. And we'll get more into that in depth in Web 2 if you're taking Web 2. Finally, the third principle that Jason brings up is that users need to be able to recognize that every page belongs to the site. So what we've been designing in this class are web pages. A website is basically just a collection of pages. That's it. You want to make sure when I go to a website and I go through the different navigation, if I go to another page and I'm staying on the same website, I need to make sure visually I'm making a connection that I'm still in the same place. Does that make sense? To not do that would be rather jarring. How many people here have been to the Trinity River campus before? Or driven by it, or seen it, seen pictures of it, right? How jarring would it be if we were to take one of the buildings for Trinity River and put it in the middle of this campus? From an aesthetic point of view. It would look really weird, right? Like, you got these, brutalist style architecture buildings that were built back in the 50s based on just function alone, no aesthetics, just suddenly going to something that was built by Radio Shack that was supposed to be the pinnacle of modern design in the 2000s. It's like, that does not work well together. By the same token, if you were to do that in your website, if you were to have different sections of your site look completely different from one another, what are the users going to think when they go from one page to the next? I've gone to a different website, right? I've been tricked. That's the key word. Users will feel tricked. So if, and you really shouldn't, but if there's a reason as to why layout should change between sections of a website, you still need to have something, some identifying visual feature or features that cement from a visual vocabulary, so to speak, that cements in the user's mind that you're still in the same site. Does this make sense? Again, imagine if, I won't keep harping on Cheesecake Factory. How about BJ's? Ever been to BJ's? Okay. They used to have about as big of a menu as Cheesecake Factory. I don't think anybody has as big of a menu as Cheesecake Factory, but yeah, there are a few. So if you were to get that book of a menu and every other page had different style photographs, different fonts, different colors, that would be very distracting, wouldn't it? It'd make it very difficult for you to actually use the menu. And we tell you in design class and in publishing class, don't do that for a reason. We want consistency. The same thing should apply to your websites. Questions about these three principles? So, users will be welcomed by the aesthetics, but they're really there for what? The content. Okay, in fact, content is king. Users need to be able to use the site based on its navigation. It needs to be simple, it needs to be easy to find, and it needs to be clear. And finally, users need to feel comfortable as they're navigating the site to ensure that they're not being tricked. Every page of the site needs to share the same design vocabulary. Questions about these three principles? How do we feel about this so far? We okay? So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy. Oh, don't do that. Oh. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a website, and I'll just continue to harp on TCC's website for this. Let's talk about the anatomy of a website. So let's break this down a little bit. So when I'm talking about anatomy, I'm talking about sections within a layout. So in this case, this is the home page. I'm not talking about individual pages. I'm just talking about if we were to break up this page into blocks, into like sections or similar sections, what would that look like? Well, first off, we would have the area that we would normally call the header. The header. Now, don't let this name fool you into thinking that I'm talking about a specific place. I'm not talking about a location on the page. I'm talking about a group of content. What usually goes in the header, the identity of the site, logo, name, brand, whatever the case may be. The navigation usually goes in the header. If there is a search function, that's usually found in the header.
Logo.
That would be under the branding, name of the site. Absolutely. That's the header. So, based on that definition, can you visually detect what the header is here on the TCC website?
From the red line up.
Well, some may say from the red line up. Others may say from the bottom of the navigation on up. What I would say is from the bottom of the navigation up. And here's the reason why. This is a content area. It's not about heading. In fact, that style, that really, and you've probably seen this on a lot of websites, right? Really big graphic, right? Eye-catching graphic, or maybe some real quick little points or something that takes up a good portion of the screen. That is what we call a hero element. Hero, because it's bigger than life. That's a hero element. It's supposed to communicate the most important thing on the page. Think of it like, from a design perspective, think of it in terms of like in HTML, your first level heading. Right? The most important content on the page needs to be a first level heading. In design, when you're using a hero image, the hero image should be the most important thing. So what TCC is currently telling me is that right now, the most important thing is to register for fall. What's the problem with that?
Fall's already started like a while ago.
Fall's already started a while ago. Is registration currently open for fall? No. What the hell? That's the most important thing. It's expired. The most important thing TCC is telling me is that nobody checks their website. Right? That's a problem. So, this is called a hero section. Obviously, not every web page has a hero section.
Is IT running this website? That explains a lot.
Cut that. All right, now, so, come on down here. So this area down here, maybe, I don't know. I'll try to remember. So, down here, this area doesn't really have a name. It's a type of layout that we'll get into a little bit later on. It doesn't really have a name. But as we're scrolling down, this area is considered below the scroll. Okay? In other words, if I were to scroll up and I'm on the TCC webpage, right? The area that I have to actually scroll to is called below the scroll. So it's kind of like below this area down here. Now, in the old days of newspapers, okay, this was a printed piece of paper that had the news of the day on it, usually in multiple columns. They were typically folded like this, okay, folded and put on a news rack. The term below the fold was news stories that were at the bottom of the front page. Okay? Above the fold, most important stories of the day. Right? TCC sucks at web design. The stories below, IT doesn't care. Alright? That's below the fold. So what we've done is that we've reappropriated those terms. Gotta make sure this is the right order. Hero. Now, we've reappropriated that in the digital age to call it below the scroll. So any content that's below the scroll is kind of considered secondary for the user because it requires the user to do something to get to that content. Does that make sense? So from a usability standpoint, you don't want the most important thing on your site to be below the scroll. You want it to be above the scroll. So as I keep coming down here, got a calendar of events. Now, this is interesting for a moment. Just take a look at this. First off, how many people realize there was actually a calendar of events on the homepage? Is this a surprise to anybody? Yeah, right? It's like,
I don't use the website.
right. It's like, I had no idea that was even there. You know what might have been a really good idea? Is maybe, I don't know, have a navigation link up at the top that says calendar of events. That drops you down to the calendar of events. Just saying. So we got a calendar of event. Again, this is a type of layout. We'll talk about what that type is. This is not a specific area or section of the site. But what we are in right now, starting with the hero, starting with the below the scroll, and now as we're kind of moving down the page, is that we are in the main content section of this page. So every page should have a header. Every page has a main content section, and that's fine. You've got really important content above the scroll, secondary content below the scroll, and as you go further down the page, the importance of the content should drop. That could be a conscious decision from a psychology standpoint. I'll give you a good example of what I mean by this. Again, as you are scrolling down the page, the content should decrease in order of importance. Because that's what the user is kind of expecting as they are scrolling down the page. If I have to continue to scroll, then the information down towards the bottom probably isn't that important. There are a lot of websites that I go to that are commercial-based websites that they're trying to sell a product, and on that product page, they don't put the price at the top, they put the price at the bottom, forcing you to scroll all the way down to find out how much is this thing. Now to them, they want you to feel like when you get down there, that ridiculous price they're asking for is not that important. It's not that much. It's only like $800 for a new watch, right? That's the same for the old watch. Or, you know, it's not a big deal if you're spending, you know, $100 on some knickknack that you probably get for $20 somewhere else. It's not a big deal. It's not that important. That's a psychology move. That's not a user interface nor a user experience. That is taking human psychology and trying to use it to manipulate the user into converting them into a sale. So I want to point out that even though we're talking about design and layout here, do not get that confused with the use of organization of content through psychology to manipulate the user, either good or bad. And if you don't think you're being manipulated when you're online, you're wrong. There's far more manipulation going on online than probably many of you understand. We can get into that in another lecture. Point is, as you go down the page, the content should decrease in importance. So we'll continue going down here, going all the way down to the bottom. Finally, at the bottom, we have another section that we can finally name. So we have the header, we've got the content area, and again, has nothing to do with placement. Header, content area, and finally down here at the bottom, we have what's called the footer. The footer. This is where you would typically find the copyright for the page. In fact, do we have a copyright in this section? Does everybody see where the copyright is? You may have to stand up if you're over here on my right.
Bottom.
Yeah, it's on the very bottom. See where it says all rights reserved, Tarrant County Gallup. That's it. That's the whole point of the footer right there. So then what the heck is all this other junk? First off, do we have more navigation down here at the bottom?
Yes.
Yeah, we do, right? It's like, wow. Let me ask you a question. Depending, compare and contrast the navigation we have at the top and the navigation that we have here. Which one do you think is more useful? Why?
Because it takes you directly to what you need instead of going to a page.
But let me stop you there. It takes who directly to what they need? What type of user?
Student.
The current student.
Anyone.
Which navigation is more useful for you? That one. Where is it located? At the bottom of the page that none of you go to and didn't even get down that far because none of you knew there was a freaking calendar of events in the middle of the page.
It even has WebAdvisor, which
Right. There's no link to WebAdvisor up at the top, is there? That might be a little helpful for a current student, right? That's a problem. Now, it's not a problem. That's well designed, to be honest with you. I like that footer, but this is what we call an enhanced or an extended footer. Because typically a footer only is for the copyright of the page. But lately, one of the main design concepts, one of the big UI design concepts that we have in web design is to employ these sort of like enhanced or extended footers where we actually have more information down at the bottom, mainly to help the users navigate the site. A lot of times you will see things like we have here where you've got social media links down here at the bottom. How many people here knew that we even had Snapchat? How many people are still surprised Snapchat is still a thing? It is interesting. Has anybody here at all ever visited any of the TCC social media pages? Why not? You have?
Once the Instagram.
And what did you find when you went there?
Well, I didn't care for it. I was like, oh, that's it. And then I didn't scroll through
10
it.
second rule.
Yeah, it's not even 10 seconds. It sounds more like 2. Like,
I was like, oh,
Nice,
I was
go
like, I
back.
saw it, like, I was like, oh, they have a page. I clicked on it, and then I was like, okay. Well,
yeah,
that's all.
that's a thing. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, this is a bit of an issue because, again, who's that social media supposed to be for? How are they using that social media? And again, that's a whole nother topic and a whole nother area in which I was involved in trying to figure out what it was that, bless you, what it was that they were trying to do from a directional standpoint with their social media, and I found out there was no direction. So, probably why it ended up at the very bottom of the page. So this is considered a footer. So you got the header, you got the content area, you got the footer. Now, typically what we end up seeing as we start to kind of go through this and this concept of layout is that we start to see that it's the content area itself that really kind of lends itself to different kinds of layouts. And this is kind of where we're going to be going into next, is layout. So, to that end, let's come back over here. Let's talk about different layout types. Now, up until about 2010, website layout was, or had, eventually became a very standard thing. Once we got past the age of Internet Explorer 6 dominating the landscape back in 2001, once we got into the 2000s, things were actually really fun as a web designer. And what I mean by that is that at that time, computers were all pretty much the same. They all pretty much had kind of the same range and size of monitors, okay? Same resolution for most of the monitors. There wasn't a whole lot of variation. And we didn't have mobile devices yet. All of that changed in 2007 when Steve Jobs introduced the world to the iPhone. Now, when the iPhone first came out, and I've got the first edition in my first version of it in my office. I can bring it in here after the break and show you guys how small it is. When it first came out, that phone was billed as being the first mobile device that could have the true internet, the real internet, in the palm of your hand. Now, for those of you who don't remember a world prior to the iPhone or cell phones at all, let me first explain. Mobile website design up until the iPhone was nearly non-existent. In order to design a website that worked on a cellular telephone, not smartphone, cellular telephone, that's what we called them, you had to actually learn a completely different language. Your web page had to be a completely different web page, had to be a completely different website. You couldn't use your current web page to bring it up on your mobile phone. You actually had to, as a web designer, you had to design a completely separate website, and then you had to do some really fancy work to tell the cell phone, oh, you mean to go to Papa John's to place an order, but what you really need is you need the Papa John's mobile page. That's what you need. And by the way, the functionality of that mobile page was like 1/10 of what you could get if you were on your computer. Good luck ordering a pizza. And no photos. So it was like, remember that video I showed you of the guy in the penthouse with the rotary telephone on his TV set, looking up news things that took like 2 hours to download and cost like $20 to actually view? Remember that? That was kind of what mobile websites were back in the 2000s. There was not a lot of need or demand to create mobile-based websites until the iPhone came out. When the iPhone came out, Steve Jobs basically said, look, we're going to give you a full web browser on a phone that's a touch screen. Again, I know this sounds weird nowadays. That was a big deal back then. The touch screen, also having full websites on your phone. Okay? So what ended up happening is that you would open up your phone, you would go to a website, and you would see the full website zoomed way out on that little itty bitty device. And this is where you would pinch to zoom, and pinch to zoom, and pinch to zoom, and okay, now I can read it. Okay? That's how you would navigate the website. But we thought it was so cool. We were stupid. But it worked, right? But overnight, every single web developer went, "Argh." Here's why. Up to that point, every single device that was connected to the internet was pretty much the same, which meant that our layouts could have a bit of a standard to them. You want a website? Great. Well, I know exactly how wide that needs to be, right? Based on what we're talking about, most people have a desktop computer. Even the laptops pretty much all had the same resolution. Great. I knew exactly what to design. If I could do it, I could do a 3-column layout, a 2-column layout. I knew exactly what I needed to be able to do to design a website. I could do it really, really, really fast. Now I've got this stupid small screen, but it was really cool. That really makes my website look terrible. Now at first, a lot of web designers were thinking, that'll never catch on. You can guess where they are today. And then you had other web designers that were like, this is something we kind of need to pay attention to. Now this was 2007. Fast forward 3 years, and we started seeing a brand new concept and an approach to web design take place, specifically a mobile-first approach. In those 3 years, we started to understand a little bit more about what the impact of this particular device was going to be. Not only that, but we had another curveball thrown to us a few years later when you started seeing things like Android phones and Windows phones. Yes, Microsoft actually made a phone at one point in time, actually get on the market. And then again later in 2009 when the iPad came out. To which all the web designers were like, oh, it's so cool. That's a third device I have to deal with now. Not only do I have to deal with desktops and laptops, now I have to deal with mobile phones and tablets. Like, come on, give me a break. Because what was happening at this time was that web designers were utilizing what we would end up calling adaptive design. It was kind of blending the idea of the earlier mobile design with our current websites together. The idea was this. You would create one website for desktop, one website for mobile, now a third website for a tablet. And when somebody comes to your website, you would, what they call, sniff what device they were on. So there was a little bit of code you could put on your page that said, this device is a mobile phone, this device is a tablet, this device is a laptop or a desktop computer. And depending on whatever device it was, you would direct them to the right page, the right design, right? Obviously, the more devices that came on the market, the more this approach became fruitless. As more and more companies started developing smartphones, as more and more companies started developing tablets, trying to manage that number of designs and pages became impossible. There was a time there, though, for a few years in the early 2010s, and I even have one in my office, where we actually had mobile testing labs, where our idea was to try to collect a lot of different kinds of devices that would kind of be representative of all the different kinds of mobile devices that are on the market, so that you could build a website and you can test it on that device to make sure that it looks correct. What ended up happening around 2010 to 2011 is we ended up with this concept, this idea, why don't we shift everything on its head? We as web designers were developing stuff and had been developing things for, at that point in time, over a decade, specifically for desktop and laptop computers first. Mobile, if anybody gave, two shakes about a mobile device, it was always an afterthought. But what if we were to flip it? At this point in time, what you need to understand is that the total internet traffic coming from mobile devices was still around 10%. In other words, the vast majority of everybody was still using a desktop or a laptop computer to view the internet. So a lot of web designers were like, it's a gimmick. It's not really that big of a deal. It's not the majority of my traffic. I'll ignore it. And guess where they are now? But many decided to start with this concept of a mobile-first approach. And what is a mobile-first approach? Well, this is what they came up with. It's a design philosophy. Its aim is to create better experiences for users by starting the design process from the smallest of screens, meaning the mobile device. And its goal is that your user's experience will be seamless on any device. I'm going to take this one step further. I'm going to contradict one part of this. It is not a design philosophy. It's a design fact. It's a reality. This is how every single website should be developed. If you're not developing with the mobile design in mind first, you're doing it wrong. Mobile devices now make up the vast majority of all traffic online, period. However, there are still people out there that do not follow this type of design approach. So, what does this entail, and how did we get to this particular philosophy? If we were to go back to the early 2010s, there was a web designer by the name of Ethan Marcotte who came up with a concept called responsive design. It was actually quite brilliant. And it was a process that was staring us in the face the entire time. I'll go more into that a little bit later on in this class when we start talking about using CSS for layout. But the point is that Ethan found something in the old versions of CSS that we hadn't really used and was able to actually reintroduce it to the world in a way that allowed us to create one web page, one set of visual instructions that would respond based on the size of the user's screen. If the user was on a mobile phone, the layout would respond and would shift to a layout that would look good on a mobile phone. If the user was on a desktop computer, the design would respond and shift to something that would look good on a desktop computer, all based on whatever criteria and layout the designer decided to use. So you would start with something that was maybe an individual column of content on a mobile phone, and when you finally moved and went to that same website on a desktop computer, it may be 3 columns of content. This was called responsive design, and it allowed us to actually design things very easily and very efficiently, and for the first time ever, we didn't have to manage multiple versions of the same website. This caught on like crazy. And as of today, it isn't necessarily called responsive web design, it's just called web design. This is now part of what you should do, just like mobile first. Now, to help us understand this a little bit more, we need to actually get in here and we need to talk about some of these different kinds of layouts. So let's talk about some of the layouts that you can employ in your web pages. Now remember, most of these are going to be based around how you lay out content in the content area of the site. The header and the footer are a completely different topic that we'll talk about later. This is really about how design, or how you are designing the content of the site. Does everyone okay with that? Anyone have a question about that definition? So, we're going to go over 5 of these, and I've got examples of each one. So we're going to start talking about the single column. Ever been on a website that's just a single column of content? We were kind of just on one, the TCC website. Single column. The single column is, and I start this off with the single column because it is the primary layout of a mobile phone, of a website on a mobile device. This is the primary layout. Because think about it for a moment. Have you ever been to a website that has multiple columns on your phone? That display has multiple columns on your phone? You ever been to a site like that? Some of you have. Is it easy to read or navigate or find the information that you want when you have multiple columns on a small, skinny phone screen? It's not. Single column is kind of the de facto standard. So, being rather punny here when I'm talking about single column, but the idea of a single column layout, right? Where just information flows in a single column. There's not multiple columns here. Well, technically there are 2. I'll give you an idea. Single column layout. Single column layout. Now, are we familiar with these design patterns? You've seen this before, right? The vast majority of the apps that are on your phone also use single column as a layout technique. Again, the reason why is because on a mobile phone, that's the most efficient type of layout. Questions about single column? Okay. I'm going to switch because that's making me hungry. All right. Split screen is your second kind of layout. This is employed when you are trying to give the user an A or B path. Right? User, I want you to either take the first path or the second path. This type of layout would have been great for the TCC homepage, right? Do you want to come to TCC? Click here. Are you currently at TCC? Sign in. Do you see that A or B path, right? Imagine instead of that hero image, if you had something that was split, and on one side you had the ability to log in, and on the other side you had the ability to register for classes. Or at least start the process to register for classes. Or maybe put it in a slightly better design. Split layouts work. And they work well. However, there's a couple of things you have to understand about this. Number one, a split layout only works when you're giving a person choice A or choice B. Okay? Typically, if you're dealing with more than two choices, this does not work well. Because a split screen layout for content is best used when you are not overloading it with information. It needs to be easily identified what path A is and what I need to do it, and what path B is and what do I need to do in order to use it. Split screens don't always have to be symmetrical. So in this case, I have a split screen layout. It's not giving me a choice A or choice B in the traditional sense, but it is giving me a sign up for a scuba course or get more information about the scuba course kind of information path here. And it's not symmetrical, which is fine. In fact, asymmetrical layout is the third layout we're going to talk about. Now, symmetry and asymmetrical layouts are one of the things that Baird actually talks about in the book. The idea here, when you're trying to create a layout or a section of content and you're using an asymmetrical layout, is that you're trying to emphasize a hierarchy of content. One side is more important than the other. So if I were to go back to this, which side is more important? The left side, right? I want people to sign up for scuba classes. The right side's still important because the right side has information about the scuba classes and pictures. So when you are creating a layout and you've got two pieces of information, but they lack the same level of, or they're not equal, we'll put it that way, right? When both of these do not have the same prominence, the same importance, they're not equal. An asymmetrical layout, when you're actually displaying this information to the user, is good. Additionally, just like this last one here, one of the things you may want to do when you're creating an asymmetrical layout is to really build up the contrast in color between the two sides. You don't want them to look similar. This one, obviously, there's a lot of contrast. It's really not as much contrast as you may think, just because we're dealing with complementary colors. But this actually has, because of the weight of both sides of the split screen, there's not a lot of contrast between these two. There's different colors, but there's not a lot of contrast. Certainly not as much as there is here. So here's an example of an asymmetrical layout. Or this one. The layout doesn't have to have information on both sides. Even though that particular image and that use of that image does convey information to the user. Questions about asymmetrical layout? Fourth, cards. The card layout, which has become pretty popular these days. Here's an example of card layout. This type of layout is used primarily by sites that have a lot of content, and they don't necessarily employ a hierarchy. In other words, there's not a level of importance between the content. How many people here have used YouTube? Okay. How many people have a subscription feed on YouTube? If you've ever gone to your subscription page on YouTube, that's a great example of a card layout. YouTube treats each one of those videos with the same importance. There's not a hierarchy. In other words, there's not like one big giant hero card saying, this is the one you need to play now because this is the most important video. No, they all have the same look, the same feel, just like these cards down here that say latest articles. Or just like each one of these properties are in this particular layout mock-up. You can see those properties down there where it says featured homes. Well, featured house, that's really bad. I should say featured homes. But point is here, each one of those cards has the same look, has the same feel, has the same size. It has the same type of information. There's nothing that tells me visually one is more important than the other. Therefore, there is not a hierarchy of content, and the content, because there is a lot of it, is displayed very neatly, very cleanly in a card. Here's another example of cards. Now this is a good example of how you can utilize cards and at the same time add interest or feature a specific card to add contrast. Which one of those cards is more important than the others? Which one? The top left. The one that says step-by-step to conduct usability testing. Does everybody see that? Why does that one stand out? Larger. It also takes up 2 spots of one card, right? So even with a card layout, you can still build interesting contrast when it comes to the importance of content. Here's a card layout on a mobile device. This is a mock-up. You can kind of see down here under recommended where it actually has these little cards for the different products. You can kind of see the conclusion of that in the top right-hand corner. Even the information itself is presented as a quote card. Questions about card layouts? Finally, the magazine or the grid layout. The magazine or the grid layout. And by the way, a lot of these layouts you can combine, right? Just like a split screen can be asymmetrical, you can utilize cards in a split screen or cards in a single column. And the magazine or the grid layout is no different. Obviously, this gets its name from periodicals, magazines, or newspapers. It's very popular. And like the card layout, it is used primarily in order to display websites that have a lot of content. The difference is that content does have a hierarchy. Some content is far more important than others, which is why this particular layout is used a lot by news websites, by websites that are pushing specific products and really have featured products that they're trying to actually push. They'll make them far more prominent in the layout than others. So a couple examples of a magazine or a grid-based layout. This is a good one for a couple of reasons. A couple of questions for you. What's the most important piece of content on this page? Which one? The top one? Our company is significant in numbers. Why? Because it's what? Yeah. Notice how large it is, right? Notice its position on the page. That gives it a specific amount of prominence that does, or at least it should communicate. Remember we're talking about hero sections, right? It's not exactly what I would call a hero section. It's kind of like a baby hero section. But it does give it prominence, and your eye immediately kind of goes to that area. Now look at the columns underneath it. Are the columns symmetrical? No, they're not, are they? What does that communicate to you as the user? Yeah. Some content in some of these columns is probably more important than others. It's a really interesting way of handling that simply by adjusting or changing and varying the width of columns. And sometimes it's not just really about handling the width of the columns. So here's an example of, on the left-hand side, what a desktop user would see on this site, and on the right-hand side, what a mobile user would see. Notice in both instances, the most important prominent article is easily identifiable. Questions about the magazine or the grid-based layout? Nope? Okay. So, that is a quick rundown of layout and chapter 1 in the book. Again, I'm not going to go over all the design concepts that he talks about, things like isolation or proximity or white space, things like that. A lot of those things we've talked about in other classes. And of course, you can go ahead and read that. You did read the book. You can go ahead and read that part of the chapter. However, at this point in time, where we are at in our web design kind of journey, you guys are all the way up until the late 90s at this point. The amount of HTML that you have learned, paragraphs, headings, lists, tables, your standard HTML document structure, all of the stuff has taken us up into the late 90s, kind of early 2000s. Starting next week, we're going to introduce CSS. We're going to do that by reviewing chapter 2 in the book on color. Because up till now, all of our websites, let's be honest, are rather bland. Adding images was nice, but it's nice to have a good splash of color. But we need to actually talk about how we can properly apply color to our web pages. How do we change the background of the browser from being white to maybe a different color? How do we change the color of the text that we actually have, the content within each of our pages? Maybe I don't want my headings to be black. Maybe I want my headings to be red. Well, I'll show you how to do that on Monday. I almost said Tuesday, sorry. But we're going to do that using CSS because up to this point, it's not that we're not going to learn any other HTML. There's certainly more structure that we do need to learn, especially when we get to layout. Because creating these sort of layouts, like these columns down here in our footer, in the TCC footer, creating this sort of layout requires us to learn how to properly structure the content so that using CSS we can tell it, okay, this is a column, this is a column, this is a column. See what I mean? So we'll learn more structure in our HTML. For the most part, we are kind of almost at the end of everything that we need to know about HTML. Which is one of the reasons why MySpace was so popular. There's not a whole lot to learn when it comes to HTML. If you don't know what MySpace is, I think Wikipedia has a good article on it. Now, over the weekend, please read chapter 2 in the book. We're going to go over that quite a lot. Now, I will warn you, when we get to color, and I'm hoping we're back in the other classroom. We're close. We're so close. I thought it was going to be today. Fortunately, it wasn't. If we are not back in 11:04 on Monday, here's what I want to do. I want to start the lecture in 11:05 because the whiteboard in there is going to be critical for us to really understand color. Here's my warning. There will be some math on Monday. Okay? And what I mean by some math, I'm not talking about polynomials. We're not going to be calculating vectors. There's no calculus involved. It's simple addition, subtraction, a little bit of multiplication and division. That's it. If you've got a phone with a calculator on it with those 4 functions, you will be okay. Alright? So I'm just giving you a heads up right now. There will be some math because we need to understand how to represent colors on the web. It's not as simple as you may think because we don't use, or at least we did not initially use, the same way of expressing color that you would in something like, say, Illustrator or InDesign or Photoshop. There's a completely different way of expressing color online. We're going to learn about that on Monday. Or, I don't know, if you read the chapter over the weekend, you're probably going to learn about it there as well. Okay? Questions? Alright, so last question I got, and then I'm going to be done. There's a reason why I didn't give you guys a break, because I didn't want to give a break and then only come back for, I figured it'd be better to get you guys done by 8 rather than continue to talk till 8:30. So here's a question that I have for y'all. Do you have any interest in seeing any of the projects I'm currently working on in relation to what we're talking about with layout? Yes? Okay. So here's what I will do. I will show you one of the projects that is getting ready to launch in the next month or so that I'm working on Monday. So when we come back together again on Monday, I don't know if I'll do that at the beginning of the class or after the lecture on color. Depends. I'll probably do it after the lecture on color if we're going to be over there. Just makes more sense to do it that way. And I'll show you guys one of the websites, and we'll kind of go over some of the decisions that I made based on this lecture of layout. Okay? Any questions? All right. So that'll be that. I am done. Look at that, before 8 o'clock. So you have the next hour and 15 minutes to finish up your table assignment, if you haven't already. Once you get that turned in, you are done. Remember, chapter 2 in the book next week. Yes? Help logging in, or? Oh, just help. Okay, I'll be right there. All right, there are no questions? I'm done. If you didn't sign in, the sign-in sheet's on the back by the Clorox wipes.